In the time before time, when the earth was still young and the skies had no memory of clouds, the world was a silent expanse of dust and stone. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast and featureless plain baked beneath the sun's relentless gaze. There were no rivers to carry the gift of water across the continent, no valleys to break the monotony of the horizon, no forests where shade might offer comfort. Life, as we understand it now, was absent. The soil was dry and cracked, and the winds carried only whispers of a creation yet to come. The sun was patient in those days, watching over the barren earth like a guardian waiting for a signal. The moon, too, lingered in the heavens, casting pale light upon a land that knew no dreams. Stars glimmered like silent witnesses to a promise hidden deep within the crust of the world. Beneath the parched ground, asleep in the cradle of eternity, rested a being of unimaginable power. The Rainbow Serpent. It had been said, even before words existed, that the serpent was older than the mountains, older than the very stones themselves. It coiled in slumber far beneath the earth's surface, wrapped in an endless spiral of scales that shimmered with every color yet unseen by humankind. Each scale held the hue of a future sky, a future sea, a future flower that had not yet bloomed. Though it lay still, the earth above it pulsed faintly with its breath, rising and falling in rhythms as slow as centuries. The serpent's dreams were the only sparks of life in an otherwise lifeless world. In its dreams, it saw rivers carving their way through the land like silver serpents of water. It saw deep valleys filled with shadows and echoes, places where creatures could one day find refuge. It saw trees rising toward the sun, and birds filling the air with songs that had not yet been sung. It saw the first people walking barefoot upon the warm soil, painting the walls of caves and telling stories to the fire. The serpent dreamed of harmony, of life interwoven with the land as threads are woven into a single fabric. But for now, all of this existed only within the sacred silence of its slumber. Yet silence is never eternal. The balance of the world was shifting, though no eye could yet see it. The sun, which had gazed so long upon the barren land, grew restless. Its heat intensified, pressing down upon the earth until cracks widened, groaning under the strain. The moon pulled upon the tides of potential hidden in the ground, stirring unseen energies. The stars, ancient and wise, whispered to one another that the time of stillness was drawing to an end point one night. As the moon shone brighter than ever before, a tremor rippled through the land. It was not the tremor of stone breaking or wind rushing, but the pulse of something alive stirring beneath. Dust rose in thin spirals, the first sign that the world was about to awaken. The serpent shifted in its sleep, its body uncoiling slightly, and the earth trembled in response. When the serpent's eyes finally opened, the darkness of the world was pierced by two radiant orbs. They were not like the eyes of any creature that would later walk the earth. Each eye contained a swirl of countless colors, shifting and merging like rivers of light. With a single glance, the serpent illuminated the world, and for the first time, the barren land seemed to shimmer with possibility. The serpent lifted its head, emerging from beneath the crust of the earth. As it moved, the ground split open, forming the first cracks that would one day become valleys. Its immense body stretched across the horizon, scales glimmering as though painted by the very essence of rainbows. Where it slithered, the soil broke apart and shifted, creating ridges, hollows, and contours. The world was no longer flat and empty. It was beginning to take shape under the serpent's passage. But though the land now bore the touch of transformation, something was still missing. Without water, the valleys were only scars upon the surface, and without rivers, the soil could not awaken into fertility. The serpent raised its head toward the heavens, and with a great breath, it called upon the unseen powers that lingered between sky and earth. Clouds gathered for the first time, summoned by its will. They rolled across the sky, dark and heavy with promise. And soon, rain began to fall that was not a timid rain. It poured with the force of creation itself, filling the valleys carved by the serpent's body. Streams gushed forth, rushing down new paths, twisting and turning until they grew into rivers. The land drank deeply, and from its thirst, life began to stir. Small shoots of green pushed their way through the wet soil, and the first grasses swayed gently in the newborn wind. The serpent watched as water spread across the land, connecting valleys to plains, rivers to lakes. Its heart swelled with pride and purpose. The silence of the world had been broken, replaced by the murmur of flowing streams and the patter of rain. For the first time, the world sang, a quiet song, but one filled with infinite promise. Yet this was only the beginning. The serpent knew that the rivers and valleys were more than just features of the land. They were the lifeblood of what was to come. Creatures would need water to survive. Trees would need valleys to anchor their roots. And people, when they emerged, would need both rivers and valleys to shape their stories. And so, the serpent rested for a moment, gazing upon the world that had begun to mold. The rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, and mist rose from the earth, veiling the horizon in mystery. The first dawn broke across the sky, painting it with colors that mirrored the serpent's own scales. The sun smiled upon the land, and the moon bowed, knowing that creation had taken its first breath. But the serpent's work was far from done. The rivers were still shallow, the valleys narrow, and life fragile. Much more remained to be shaped, and with each coil of its immense body, the serpent would write the story of the land. This was the beginning of all things. This was the dawn of rivers and valleys. This was the awakening of the Rainbow Serpent. When the Rainbow Serpent rose fully from its bed beneath the earth, the world trembled as though it had taken its first true breath. The ground, which had lain flat and silent for ages, shifted beneath the immense coils of its body. Dust and stone were lifted into the air, scattering across the horizon in clouds of ochre and gray. The serpent uncoiled slowly, each movement deliberate, each ripple of its muscles echoing like thunder across the barren land. Its scales shimmered with brilliance that defied description. No single color defined them, for they were all colors at once. Deep reds that seemed to burn like fire, cool blues that mirrored the first hint of water, greens that promised the growth of forests, and radiant yellows that carried the warmth of the sun. As it moved, the scales caught the light of dawn, scattering rainbows across the desolate plain. It was as though the sky itself had descended to rest upon the serpent's back. The serpent lifted its head high, tasting the air with a tongue that flickered like lightning. The air was dry, cracked with silence, offering little but dust. Still, the serpent sensed possibility in it, an invisible pulse waiting to be shaped. Its eyes, vast orbs of swirling light, swept across the horizon. Everywhere it looked, the land shivered, for creation recognized its maker. The first task of the serpent was simple, yet monumental, to give the land form. The plains stretched endlessly, and so the serpent began to move, dragging its colossal body across the earth. Wherever it slithered, the ground split open, leaving behind deep grooves. Some were shallow, winding trails that would later become creeks. Others were vast, plunging chasms that would widen into valleys. Each movement carved a mark upon the land, a signature of power etched into the bones of the world. The serpent traveled northward, its body weaving like a ribbon of light across the plain. With each curve of its form, hills rose from the soil, ridges taking shape along the edges of its path. It turned east, and the land fell away, creating broad, sweeping basins. The serpent did not work with tools nor with hands. Its body was enough. The earth responded to it instinctively, reshaping itself to accommodate its immense passage. The serpent's movements were not aimless. Deep within, it carried the memory of its dreams. Those dreams whispered of rivers that would one day quench the thirst of the soil, valleys that would cradle life, and sacred pathways that people would walk in reverence. Guided by this memory, it traced patterns across the land, ensuring that nothing was left untouched. As it traveled, the serpent encountered obstacles, jagged outcrops of stone, hardened by the ages. With a single thrust of its body, it shattered them into fragments, scattering boulders across the landscape. These stones would one day become landmarks, places where future generations would gather to remember the serpent's journey. In other places, it burrowed beneath the earth, tunneling through the soil, leaving behind hollows that would later become caves. These caves would serve as shelters, secret chambers for stories to echo within. The serpent's journey was not hurried. It moved with patience, knowing that true creation demanded time. Days stretched into nights, and nights into dawns, though the world had not yet learned the rhythm of seasons. The sun followed the serpent faithfully, casting its glow upon every new curve of land. The moon hovered above, pale and watchful, illuminating the serpent's path when shadows fell. One evening, after a long stretch of carving valleys and ridges, the serpent paused upon a high mound. From this vantage point, it surveyed the land. For the first time, the plain no longer appeared endless and uniform. Instead, it bore texture and shape. There were depressions that would one day hold lakes, pathways that would guide streams, and ridges that offered the promise of shelter. The serpent felt a deep satisfaction, though it knew this was but the skeleton of creation. Yet even as it worked, the serpent felt a weight pressing upon its heart. For though valleys had been carved and hollows created, the land remained dry. Dust still rose in spirals whenever the wind passed. Without water, the serpent's efforts would mean nothing. The valleys would collapse into desolation, and the ridges would serve only as scars upon a barren surface. Creation was incomplete, and incompleteness gnawed at the serpent's soul. The serpent turned its gaze skyward. Clouds had not yet learned to wander freely across the heavens, but the serpent's call stirred them into being. With a deep hiss that rolled like distant thunder, it summoned vapor from the edges of existence. Thin wisps began to gather above, curling into shapes that grew darker and heavier with each breath. Soon, the entire sky was filled with billowing clouds, shadowing the land in anticipation. The serpent struck the ground with its mighty tail, and lightning burst forth, splitting the sky. Rain began to fall, at first a trickle, then a torrent. The serpent's valleys drank deeply, filling with streams that twisted along the paths it had carved. Water gushed down the ridges, crashing into basins that became lakes. Dust dissolved into fertile mud, and the soil awoke, trembling with the potential for life. The serpent moved through the rain with joy, its scales glowing brighter as droplets clung to its body, refracting light into arcs of color. Rainbows leapt from valley to valley, connecting the sky to the earth in shimmering bridges. This was the serpent's gift, the binding of heaven and earth, the weaving of life into the bones of creation. As rivers formed, the serpent drank from them, testing the flow. The water was sweet, carrying the promise of fertility. Wherever it flowed, small green shoots pushed through the softened soil, trembling under the weight of raindrops. The serpent watched with pride as the first grasses unfurled, their blades reaching toward the sun. In time, these grasses would spread into wide plains, feeding creatures yet unborn. But in that moment, the serpent was content. It lay coiled beside a newborn river, watching the water rush and swirl. The valleys echoed with the sound of its creation, the laughter of streams, the rumble of waterfalls. For the first time, the world sang with more than silence. It sang with life in its earliest, most fragile form. The serpent knew that its journey was only beginning. It had carved the pathways and brought the waters, but much remained undone. Creatures would need to be awakened, and people would one day need guidance. The rivers and valleys were not merely landscapes. They were lifelines, sacred threads tying the future to the past. The serpent's task was far greater than shaping land. It was to shape destiny itself. As the rain eased and dawn broke once more, the serpent lifted its head and gazed across the horizon. Its eyes glimmered with colors beyond comprehension, reflecting the rivers it had birthed and the valleys it had carved. It had awakened, and with its awakening, the world had begun. The newborn rivers whispered softly as they trickled across the valleys carved by the serpent's colossal form. Their waters, though fresh and pure, were still young, thin streams winding hesitantly through the scars of the land. They shimmered beneath the rising sun, their surfaces catching fragments of rainbow reflected from the serpent scales. The world, once silent, now hummed with sound. The gurgle of water, the sigh of wind, the faint rustle of grass sprouting in clusters. Yet the serpent knew this was only a beginning that a shallow river cannot endure. Without depth and strength, the streams would vanish in the heat, swallowed once more by the thirst of the land. The serpent, ancient and wise, understood this truth. To give permanence to creation, it would have to carve deeper, gouging valleys wide and strong enough to cradle water through ages. And so, the serpent set forth again. It uncoiled its massive body, gliding along the riverbeds it had already formed. As it moved, its weight pressed heavily into the soil, widening the channels, deepening their courses. Hills rose higher on either side of its path, creating walls that would shelter rivers from the harsh breath of the wind. Where the serpent curved, great bends formed in the water's flow. Where it lingered, pools gathered, deep and still, waiting for creatures that would one day swim within. The ground shook with every motion, as though the world itself groaned under the labor of its own becoming. Dust lifted into the sky, mixing with the lingering mist of rainfall, and the two fused into a haze that softened the light of the sun. In this twilight glow, the serpent's scales gleamed more brilliantly than ever, casting arcs of color that spanned horizon to horizon. Times, the serpent burrowed beneath the soil, tunneling deep into the earth. When it rose again, the ground collapsed behind it, leaving vast gorges. Water rushed eagerly into these new channels, cascading down cliffs to form the first waterfalls. Their roar echoed through the valleys, a song of power that celebrated the serpent's labor. The rivers danced in response, their currents swirling with newfound vigor. The serpent's journey took it across vast distances. It traveled southward, dragging its body in sweeping motions that split the land into ridges and hollows. It traveled westward, gouging canyons that opened like great mouths toward the setting sun. Each direction bore the mark of its passage, and with each mark, the earth became more alive. Along its path, the serpent paused often to admire its work. From a high ridge, it gazed down upon the valleys below. The rivers glittered like silver threads, weaving a tapestry that stretched beyond sight. Pools lay like mirrors, reflecting the heavens above. The serpent knew that one day, creatures would gather by these waters, drawn by thirst and sustained by abundance. But beauty alone was not the serpent's purpose. Creation required balance, places of stillness as well as motion, shadows as well as light. So, in some regions, the serpent carved valleys deep and narrow, where the sun could scarcely reach the bottom. In others, it widened the land into broad floodplains, where water could wander freely. It shaped the land not with uniformity, but with diversity, ensuring that every creature yet unborn would find its place. The rivers began to change under its guidance. Where once they had trickled timidly, they now roared with strength, fed by waterfalls and deepened channels. Their currents carved further still, gnawing at the rock and soil, amplifying the serpent's design. Already, the land had learned to continue shaping itself, echoing the serpent's labor with its own. Life, too, began to stir more boldly. The grasses that had first sprouted now grew taller, spreading in waves of green that rippled under the wind. Shrubs unfurled along the riverbanks, their roots drinking greedily from the wet soil. Moss crept across stones, softening the harshness of rock with living green. Insects, tiny and unassuming, began to crawl upon leaves and hum in the air, their presence faint but vital. They were the first messengers of a future where the land would teem with life. The serpent watched these changes with quiet pride. Though it had not directly summoned these small beings, it knew they were born from the harmony of water and soil, from the gift of valleys and rivers. Each living thing was a note in the growing song of the world, a song the serpent itself had begun, yet not all was easy. In its carving, the serpent sometimes encountered stone too stubborn to yield. There were mountains buried deep beneath the plain, ancient bones of the world resistant to change. When a serpent pressed against them, the land shook violently, cracks racing across the surface. Thunder boomed from within the earth, and lightning split the sky in sympathy. These struggles scar the serpent, leaving some of its scales chipped and dulled. But the serpent did not falter. Creation was never without struggle, and every scar it bore became a mark of its devotion at last. After many days of toil, the serpent coiled upon a high plateau to rest. Around it stretched a land transformed. Valleys spread like open arms, rivers gleamed like serpents of silver, and waterfalls sang their endless hymns. The plain that had once been barren now carried the marks of story, a story written in earth and water. The serpent lowered its head to drink from one of the wide rivers. Its reflection stared back, an endless body of color, eyes bright with the knowledge of what had been achieved. Yet behind that pride lay a deeper understanding. The valleys and rivers were not the end of creation, but the beginning of a promise. Life was stirring, fragile and new. The serpent's role was to guide it, to ensure that the rivers it had carved would sustain not only plants but creatures, and one day, people. For now, the serpent rested, coiled upon the plateau as the rivers ran below. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, the song of flowing water, and the faint hum of insects in the grasses. Creation had moved beyond silence. The world was alive, and with each breath of the serpent, it grew richer still. This was the gift of valleys carved deeper, of rivers flowing stronger, the foundation of a world that would endure. And though much remained to be done, the serpent knew that its work was already eternal, etched into the earth itself. The valleys carved by the Rainbow Serpent had begun to cradle streams of water, yet these streams were scattered and uncertain. Some trickled hesitantly through narrow channels, while others pooled in hollows, forming lakes that shimmered beneath the dawn. Though beautiful, they lacked unity. Water was life, but life demanded connection, and the serpent knew that scattered streams could not alone sustain the great vision it carried within its ancient heart. What the world required was a river unlike any other, a river vast enough to link valleys to plains, mountains to seas, and soil to sky. A river that would serve as the backbone of creation, carrying not only water, but also the memory of the serpent itself. It would be the first great river, the mother of all rivers to follow. The serpent began its task with solemn purpose. From the high plateau where it had rested, it uncoiled its colossal body, stretching farther than ever before. It pressed its head against the soil and slithered forward with force, gouging a channel deeper than any it had made thus far. The ground split open beneath its weight, rumbling as though the earth itself cried out in awe. Stones cracked, cliffs crumbled, and dust rose in vast plumes that darkened the sky. Yes, it moved. The serpent carved a path that cut across the land for endless distances. Unlike the smaller streams it had already shaped, this channel was deliberate and unwavering, a line of destiny drawn upon the earth. The serpent twisted and coiled, weaving the river's future curves and bends, but always it pressed forward, guided by the memory of its dreams. The effort was immense. At times, the serpent paused, exhausted by the weight of creation. Its body trembled, scales dulled by friction against stone. But with each breath, it remembered the silence of the barren land before its awakening, and that memory filled it with renewed strength. It would not allow silence to reign again. When at last the channel was complete, stretching from distant mountains to the wide, open plains, the serpent lifted its head toward the heavens. It hissed a call so deep that it seemed to shake the stars themselves. Clouds gathered instantly, rolling across the sky in dark waves. Thunder cracked, lightning flashed, and rain poured in sheets heavier than any before. The valleys drank greedily, sending water rushing down their slopes. Streams swelled and overflowed, merging into the channel the serpent had carved. Water surged forward, tumbling down cliffs in roaring cascades, filling the deep path with unstoppable force. Soon, a mighty river roared across the land, its current swift and powerful, carrying life wherever it touched. The serpent watched with pride as the river claimed its path. Along the banks, grasses grew taller, bending under the weight of rain. Bushes sprouted, their leaves unfurling in shades of green unseen before. In the fertile soil of the floodplains, the first trees took root, their trunks stretching upward, their branches reaching toward the light. Birds, newly awakened by the serpent's creation, flitted among the branches, filling the air with tentative songs. This was more than water. This was the lifeblood of the land. The great river became a mirror of the serpent itself. Vast, winding, eternal. It sang as it moved, its voice deep and resonant, echoing across valleys and plains. Its waters sparkled with fragments of rainbow, carrying the memory of the scales that had carved its path. To gaze upon it was to see the serpent's spirit flowing endlessly, unbroken and alive. The serpent followed the river's course, winding along its banks. Wherever it went, it left blessings. With a brush of its tail, it widened the floodplains, ensuring they could one day feed countless creatures. With the curve of its body, it deepened pools into sacred billabongs, places of stillness where water would linger even in times of scarcity. It pressed its chest to the soil, leaving imprints that became wetlands, rich and fertile, brimming with promise. At the T1 bend of the river, the serpent paused, gazing into the waters. Its reflection rippled back, a living rainbow broken by the current. The serpent spoke softly, its voice like the wind through hollow stone. "You will carry my memory," it said to the river. "You will nourish the land and all that is to come. You are my gift, my child, my song made flesh." The river seemed to answer, its current swirling in patterns that sparkled with color. It rushed onward, eager to fulfill the purpose given to it days past. The great river transformed the land even further. Fish appeared in its depths, darting through the currents like silver sparks. Frogs sang from the wetlands, their voices echoing beneath the stars. Insects multiplied, their hum a constant chorus. With them came larger creatures, reptiles basking upon the banks, mammals lapping from the waters, birds soaring above the canopy that now shaded the floodplains. The serpent marveled at this abundance. Each creature was a thread in the tapestry it had woven, each life a testament to the power of rivers and valleys. The silence of the beginning was gone forever, replaced by a harmony of sound, the rush of water, the rustle of leaves, the calls of countless beings. But with abundance came responsibility. The serpent knew that the great river was not simply a creation to admire, but a trust to be protected. If ever the river dried or faltered, life would wither, and the silence would return. So the serpent coiled beside the river and vowed to guard it always, to ensure its flow endured through time, that on nights when the moon rose high and full, the serpent would glide into the waters, its body shimmering beneath the surface. As it swam, the river glowed with arcs of light, rainbows stretching from bank to bank. To those who would one day live upon the land, these rainbows would serve as a reminder. The serpent was still present, watching, protecting, and guiding. Thus, the great river was born, not merely as water flowing through valleys, but as a living spirit, an eternal bond between the land and its maker. It carried the essence of the rainbow serpent in every ripple, every bend, every drop. To follow its course was to follow the serpent's journey. To drink from its waters was to partake in its blessing. And though more rivers would come, feeding from mountains and plains, this one remained the first, the greatest, the mother of them all. Its flow was the heartbeat of the land, steady and unyielding, echoing with the promise of life everlasting. The serpent lay beside it, content, knowing that the world had gained its lifeblood. Yet, deep within, it sensed that this was only another beginning. For rivers and valleys were not created for water alone. They were meant to nurture something greater still. Beings who would walk upright, speak with voices, and weave stories that would echo alongside the serpent's own. The time of those beings had not yet come. But soon, the serpent knew, the great river would carry them too. The great river roared with strength, carrying the memory of the rainbow serpent in its every current. Its waters twisted through valleys and floodplains, glittering with fragments of rainbow that danced upon its surface. Life had flourished along its banks. Fish swam in its depths, birds sang in the trees that shaded its edges, and animals gathered to drink from its eternal flow. Yet something was still missing. For all the beauty and abundance the serpent had nurtured, there were no voices to speak of it, no hands to paint its story upon the rocks, no hearts to revere the river as sacred. The serpent knew that creation was incomplete. Life needed storytellers, beings who could see the river not only as water, but as spirit, who could pass on its song to generations unborn. One dawn, as the mist rose from the river and the first rays of sunlight turned the waters to liquid gold, the serpent uncoiled from its resting place. With a deep rumble, it pressed its vast body into the soil, shaping new hollows along the riverbank. Into these hollows it breathed softly, releasing fragments of its essence, light from its scales, warmth from its breath, and wisdom from its ancient dreams. From the soil and water mingled with the serpent's spirit, figures began to stir. At first, they were as fragile as shadows, their outlines wavering in the morning mist. But slowly, they gained form: arms, legs, faces, and voices. They stood upright, blinking against the brilliance of the rising sun, their eyes filled with wonder at the world around them. Thus, the first people were born. They gazed upon the river with awe, their reflections shimmering back at them from the surface. They felt its cool touch upon their hands, drank deeply from its flow, and felt life surge within their veins. The river was not just water to them. It was kin, a living being whose spirit they could sense. In its voice they heard whispers of the serpent, and in its curves they saw the vast body of their creator etched into the land. The serpent watched them silently, coiled among the trees at the river's edge. It did not speak, for words were no longer necessary. The first people carried fragments of its spirit. They would know, instinctively, the reverence owed to the river and valleys. And indeed, the people began to sing. Their voices rose into the morning air, soft and tentative at first, then stronger, carrying melodies shaped by gratitude. They sang of the river's gift, of the water that quenched their thirst and filled their bellies with fish. They sang of the valleys, where trees gave them shelter and fruit. They sang of the serpent, whose scales they imagined stretched across the heavens, painting the sky with rainbows after rain. Their songs echoed across the land, blending with the rush of water and the cries of birds, forming the first chorus of human reverence. In time, the first people learned to live by the river's rhythm. They followed its course when they traveled, for the river always led them to sustenance. They built shelters beneath the trees that lined its banks, weaving branches and grasses into homes. They crafted tools from stones smoothed by the river's current, shaped by its endless patience. They painted the walls of nearby caves with ochre and clay, their hands tracing the flowing lines of the serpent's body, immortalizing its journey in images of color. Every action they took was a conversation with the river. When they hunted, they gave thanks to the waters for feeding the animals. When they gathered fruits, they offered seeds back to the soil, ensuring the land's bounty would continue. They understood, without being told, that they were part of the river's story, not separate from night. They gathered by fires along the riverbank. Elders, though time had only just begun, and their wisdom came not from years but from the spirit within, told stories of the serpent's awakening. They spoke of how the world had once been silent and empty, until the serpent carved the valleys and summoned the waters. They taught that every bend of the river was a mark of the serpent's body, every rainbow a reminder of its presence. Children listened with wide eyes, their faces glowing in the firelight. They learned that the river was not merely a source of survival, but a sacred being, one to be honored with song, dance, and respect. They learned that to harm the river would be to harm themselves, for its spirit and theirs were bound together. The serpent, hidden in the shadows of the forest, listened to these stories with quiet satisfaction. The first people had understood. They had embraced the river not only as a gift, but as a kinship, and through their songs, the serpent's memory would endure. Seasons began to turn. Rains came, filling the river with roaring strength, flooding its banks and nourishing the plains. In times of flood, the people danced, celebrating the abundance of life the river brought. When the waters receded and the sun burned hot, they followed the river's narrowed course, gathering at the billabongs where water lingered. The rhythm of the river became the rhythm of their lives, and in this rhythm, they found harmony. But harmony is delicate, as fragile as a song carried by the wind. Though the first people lived with reverence, they were still young. They had not yet learned the weight of choice, the power of desire. For now, they were pure in their gratitude, their hearts bound closely to the river's spirit. But the serpent knew that in the long story of creation, challenges would arise, challenges that would test not only the people, but also the balance it had worked so hard to weave. For the moment, however, peace reigned. The great river flowed eternal, and the first people flourished along its banks. Their songs filled the air, their footsteps marked the soil, and their hands painted the story of their Creator upon stone. The world was no longer silent. It spoke with many voices, river, tree, bird, and human, woven into a single harmony. The rainbow serpent rested, watching, its eyes glowing with the shifting colors of dawn. It knew the journey of creation was far from complete. But in the laughter of the first people, in their songs by the firelight, it heard a promise that the story of rivers and valleys would live on, carried by human voices for as long as the waters flowed. For many cycles of the sun and moon, the first people lived in harmony with the great river. They sang their songs of gratitude, painted the serpent's story upon stone, and followed the rhythm of the water as faithfully as a child follows the guidance of a parent. The land answered their respect with abundance. Fish leapt in the currents, fruits ripened along the banks, and animals came in steady numbers for the people to hunt. Life flowed as seamlessly as the river itself. But harmony, though sacred, is fragile. Within the hearts of the first people stirred a new and unfamiliar feeling. Desired, it began quietly, almost imperceptibly. One hunter, noticing how plentiful the fish were in a certain bend of the river, claimed that bend as his own, forbidding others to cast their nets there. Another family, drawn to a fertile grove of fruit trees, began to guard it fiercely, unwilling to share as freely as before. What had once been gifts from the river and land were now seen as possessions to be kept and defended. At first, these acts seemed small. The songs of gratitude still rose each evening. The fires still flickered along the riverbank. But beneath the surface, like pebbles gathering in a stream, tensions accumulated. Whispers grew among the people. Why should one have more fish than another? Why should one family gather all the fruit while others go hungry? The serpent sensed this change long before it was spoken aloud. Hidden in the forest shadows, it watched as the first people quarreled over the bounty of the land. It heard their voices rise not in song, but in anger, their hands clutching tightly at what had once been shared. Its heart grew heavy, for it had given rivers and valleys as a gift of unity, not as prizes to be divided. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the river glowed with golden fire, two groups of people clashed at a fertile bend of the water. Nets tore as they pulled against one another. Voices rose in fury, and blows were exchanged. The great river, once a place of harmony, became a stage for conflict. The serpent coiled nearby, unseen, and the ground trembled beneath its sorrow. Lightning flickered in the sky, though no storm had been called. The river surged unexpectedly, spilling over its banks as if to warn the people. Yet they did not heed the warning. Their anger was too strong, their desire too sharp. As moons passed, the discord deepened. Families claimed stretches of the river as their own, marking territories with stones and branches. They guarded trees and hunting grounds, sometimes driving others away with force. Songs of gratitude became rarer, replaced by arguments over who deserved more. Even the paintings on the cave walls began to change. Where once they depicted the flowing body of the serpent, now they showed men holding spears, nets, and fire. The serpent's grief grew into anger. Had it not given them rivers to sustain all equally? Had it not carved valleys wide enough to hold abundance for generations? Why then did they hoard, as though the river's gifts might vanish with the next dawn? The serpent hissed in the night, its breath stirring the trees, but the people mistook the sound for mere wind. One night, the serpent rose from the water itself, its scales shimmering with moonlight, its eyes burning with colors both beautiful and terrifying. The people who saw it fell to their knees in fear. The serpent's voice rolled like thunder across the valley. "Children of my waters," it spoke, "you have forgotten. The river was not given to one alone. The valleys do not belong to a single hand. They are the veins of the earth, the lifeblood of all. To hoard is to wound the river. To quarrel is to wound yourselves." The people bowed, trembling, and for a time they remembered. They sang songs of apology, offered fish back to the river, and repainted the caves with rainbows and flowing lines. Peace returned, but only briefly. Desire, once awakened, is not easily silenced. Seasons changed. Drought came one year when the rains delayed their return. The river thinned, its current slower, its pools shallower. Hunger gnawed at the people, and fear whispered that the river might not provide enough. In their desperation, old quarrels resurfaced with greater intensity. Spears were raised, voices shouted, and blood stained the soil by the water's edge. The serpent's fury ignited. It coiled through the river, churning the water into waves, overturning canoes, and scattering the people along the banks. Lightning split the sky, and thunder boomed as if the heavens themselves condemned their strife. Yet even punishment could not erase the seed of desire. The people scattered, some clinging to their nets and spears, others weeping as they fled. For the first time, the serpent doubted. It had dreamed of rivers and valleys as gifts of harmony, yet the people twisted them into tools of greed. Was this a flaw in the people, or in the serpent itself for dreaming them into being? The question lingered, heavy as stone, coiled in the depths of its heart. Still, the serpent did not abandon them. It could not. The rivers and valleys were bound to the people as much as to the land. But it resolved to test them, to teach them that the gifts of creation demanded balance and respect. If they would not learn through abundance, then perhaps they would learn through trial. And so, the serpent withdrew into the depths of the great river, its body vanishing beneath the surface. The waters grew calm once more, but the air carried a tension, as though the land itself held its breath. The people looked upon the quiet river with unease, for they sensed that the serpent's patience was waning. The river still flowed, but it no longer sang as joyfully as before. Its waters were darker, its current heavier. The first people continued to drink, to fish, to bathe, but in their hearts they felt the serpent's watchful eyes. Every rainbow that arched across the sky after rain seemed less like a blessing and more like a warning. The world had shifted. Harmony had given way to discord, gratitude to desire. The serpent knew that the time of trials had come. The rivers and valleys would endure, but whether the people would endure alongside them was a question only their choices could answer. The silence before the storm was heavier than any song the first people had ever known. Though the river still flowed and the valleys still stretched wide beneath the sky, there was a weight in the air, as if the land itself held a breath too long. Children clung to their mothers at night, whispering that they saw strange colors ripple beneath the water. Hunters hesitated before casting their nets, sensing unseen eyes in the depths. The rainbow serpent had withdrawn into the heart of the river, coiled in its sorrow and fury. For countless seasons it had given freely, waters to drink, lands to roam, valleys to shelter, and abundance beyond measure. But gratitude had withered, replaced by quarreling and greed. Desire, once a spark, had grown into fire, and that fire threatened to consume the harmony the serpent had labored to weave. One night, when the moon was hidden and the sky lay shrouded in darkness, the serpent stirred. Its body rolled beneath the water, vast enough to churn the current into whirlpools. Fish scattered in panic, trees bent as if bowing to its passage. Slowly, it rose, scales shimmering with colors unseen in daylight, hues that danced between beauty and terror. Its eyes burned like stormlight, reflecting both sorrow and fury. The first people, camped along the riverbank, awoke to trembling earth. Fires flickered, sparks flying into the air as the ground shifted. The river swelled with unnatural speed, its roar louder than thunder. Then the serpent's voice came, vast and resonant, shaking the valleys. "Children of my rivers, you have wounded the gift I gave. You quarrel over waters that flow for all. You hoard the bounty of valleys that were carved to nourish many. You spill blood upon the soil I shaped with care. You have forgotten the song of harmony. And for this, you must be reminded." Before the people could respond, the serpent lashed its massive body against the riverbed. Waves surged, towering walls of water rushing across the plains. Camps were swept away, nets torn, and canoes dashed against rocks. Families clutched one another as the flood carried them downstream. The cries of children mingled with the roar of water, a chorus of fear that echoed through the night. Some fled to the higher cliffs, scrambling with bleeding hands to escape the rising torrent. Others clung to tree trunks, praying for mercy. But mercy was not easily given. The serpent's fury was not blind. It struck where discord had been strongest, where greed had burned hottest. The fertile bend of the river, once fought over by two groups, was swallowed by the flood, its soil dragged away into the depths. The grove of fruit trees, once guarded selfishly, was uprooted, its branches splintered and scattered. For days, the storm raged. Rain fell without ceasing, drawn from the heavens by the serpent's breath. Lightning split the sky, striking trees and setting them ablaze even as the flood tried to quench them. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat of judgment. The land itself seemed to cry out, reshaping under the serpent's wrath. Valleys deepened, cliffs crumbled, and new channels carved their way across the plains. And yet, even amid destruction, there was purpose. The serpent was not merely lashing out, it was teaching. Each place where selfishness had taken root, it scoured clean. Each territory claimed too fiercely was erased, returned to the wild flow of the river. The serpent sought to remind the people that nothing belonged to them alone. All belonged to the river, to the land, to the balance of creation. When at last the floodwaters began to recede, the world looked different. Where there had been gentle slopes, there were now jagged cliffs. Where there had been a single wide river, there were now branching streams, cutting new paths through the valleys. Lakes glimmered in hollows the serpent had gouged with its coils. The land was scarred, yet beautiful in its raw transformation, a reminder of both fury and creation. The people, scattered and weary, gathered upon the high grounds. They looked down at the altered world with awe and fear. Many had been lost to the flood, carried away into the depths. Others stood trembling, clutching nothing but the clothes on their backs, their possessions gone. Hunger gnawed, grief weighed heavy, but above all was the memory of the serpent's eyes, shining with sorrow as much as anger. Among the survivors, the elders spoke. Their voices shook, but they carried the weight of understanding. "We have angered the serpent. We quarreled when we should have shared. We hoarded when we should have given." The floods were not only punishment, but reminder. The rivers do not belong to us. They belong to the serpent, to the earth, to all life. We are only keepers, not owners. The younger ones listened, their hearts torn between fear and defiance. Some wept and vowed never to forget the serpent's lesson. Others whispered that the serpent was too harsh, that survival left no room for sharing. In their whispers, the spark of desire still lingered, though dimmed by grief. The serpent, hidden once more beneath the river's surface, listened. It knew its wrath had scarred the land and shaken the people, but it also knew the lesson was not complete. Destruction alone could not mend hearts. The people must choose, freely, to honor the balance, or else their discord would return again and again. For now, the serpent slept in restless coils, its dreams filled with visions of rivers flowing clear and songs rising once more from grateful voices. But deep in those dreams, it also saw shadows, whispers of future conflicts, trials yet to come. The first people rebuilt their camps along the altered river. They sang songs of mourning for those lost, songs of reverence for the serpent's power, and songs of caution to remind children never to take more than was needed. Their paintings changed too. Now the cave walls bore images of towering waves, lightning, and the serpent's blazing eyes. The story of the flood was etched into memory, to be carried forward as warning. And yet, as seasons passed and the land healed, abundance returned. Fish filled the new streams, fruit grew again in the valleys, and animals roamed the plains. Life, resilient as always, found a way to flourish. The people, too, flourished, though with scars upon their hearts, scars that reminded them of what happens when balance is broken. But the serpent knew, scars can fade. Songs of gratitude can be forgotten. Desire, like water, always seeks a way through stone. The trials of wrath had reshaped the land, but the greater trial, the trial of the human heart, was far from over. When the floods receded and the thunder quieted, the first people stood upon scarred land, humbled and broken. Valleys they had once known were carved deeper, rivers split into many streams, and whole groves of trees lay uprooted. They were alive, but altered, marked not only by loss of homes and kin, but by the memory of the Rainbow Serpent's wrath. For many nights, silence reigned among them. The songs they once sang around their fires were stilled, replaced by the low moans of mourning. Children cried for mothers carried away by floods, and elders stared at the horizon with hollow eyes. The people knew they had been punished, yet they struggled to understand how they might heal the wound they had opened in the serpent's heart. It was an old woman, her hair white as ash, who first broke the silence. Gathering the survivors, she pointed to the river that still flowed, altered but unbroken. "The serpent did not destroy us," she said. "It tested us. The waters still run, and so long as they do, there is hope. But hope is not given freely. We must earn it. We must show that we remember the song of harmony, not only in words but in deeds." Her voice carried like wind through dry grass. Slowly, others lifted their heads. The young listened, and though grief weighed heavy, a spark stirred within them. The idea that the serpent's wrath was not the end, but the beginning of a journey toward atonement. The pilgrimage begins. The elders decreed that the people would walk the length of the rivers, from their high mountain springs to the low floodplains where they spilled into the sea. At every bend, they would offer songs and gifts. At every valley, they would paint and carve the serpent's story upon the rocks. Their journey would be both physical and spiritual, a weaving together of memory, gratitude, and promise as the people began their pilgrimage. They carried little, for most of their possessions had been lost to the flood. Spears, nets, baskets woven from reeds, and ochre pigments for painting were all they had. But they carried something greater, the determination to reconcile with the serpent that as they walked, they spoke to the land. At every stream, they dipped their hands into the water, whispering words of thanks. At every tree, they left offerings of seeds or small carvings. At every hunting ground, they took only what was needed, leaving the rest untouched. Children, guided by elders, learned to sing again. Their songs were different now, somber, slow, but filled with reverence. They sang not of abundance, but of balance, not of possession, but of belonging. The melodies rose into the sky, carried by winds and echoed by birds. Encounters with the land, the pilgrimage was not easy. The land, reshaped by the serpent's fury, tested them at every step. In one valley, jagged cliffs blocked their path, forcing them to climb with bleeding hands. The rocks were sharp, cutting skin and leaving scars. But the elders told them to see the pain as a reminder. The valleys were carved with sacrifice, and so too must humans bear trials to earn their place within creation. In another place, the river split into many streams, confusing hunters who had once relied on familiar bends for fish. Hunger gnawed at the people, yet instead of quarreling, they worked together, weaving larger nets and sharing their catch equally. For the first time since discord began, no voice rose in anger. Instead, laughter returned, faint but true. Night, when stars blazed across the sky, The people gathered around fires and retold the story of the flood. Children painted the serpent's coiled body on cave walls, surrounding it with lightning and waves. Elders added to the paintings, showing people bowing in humility before the serpent. These images became their covenant, a promise carved in stone that they would never forget. Dreams of the serpent during the pilgrimage. Dreams came to many. The old woman dreamed of the serpent rising from the ocean, its scales glittering with all the stars. It whispered, "Walk with care, for each step is upon my back." A young boy dreamed of drinking from the river, only to see rainbow light flow through his veins. In his dream, he sang, and his voice carried not only to the people, but to the trees, the rocks, and even the fish. He awoke trembling, certain he had been chosen as a messenger. The people took these dreams as signs. The serpent was watching, listening, weighing their hearts. Their journey was not in vain. The ceremony of renewal at last, after many seasons of walking, they reached the mouth of the great river, where fresh water kissed the salt of the sea. Here, they built a great fire and prepared the ceremony of renewal. From every family, an offering was chosen, a carved figure, a painted stone, a woven basket filled with seeds. They placed these upon the fire, the smoke rising into the night sky like prayers. Around the fire, they danced in slow, flowing movements, mimicking the serpent's body as it coiled through the land. Their songs rose together, louder and stronger than before, voices layered with grief, gratitude, and hope. Children laughed as they painted rainbows across their bodies. Elders wept as they cast ashes into the sea, and hunters laid down their spears to show they would take no more than was given. The sea responded with waves that shimmered beneath the moonlight. A rainbow, faint but clear, arched across the night sky, though no rain had fallen. The people gasped, falling to their knees. They knew the serpent had heard. The covenant from that night onward, the people vowed to live differently. No bend of the river would belong to one alone. No grove would be guarded as possession. What the land gave, they would share. What they took, they would replenish. The elders declared new laws. Each hunt must be followed by song, to thank the spirits of the land. Each gathering must leave seeds behind, to ensure future harvests. Each family must paint or carve to pass on the serpent's story. These were not burdens, but honors, ways to walk in balance with creation. The serpent did not rise from the water that night, nor speak with thunder. But in the silence, the people felt its presence. The river flowed with gentler sound. The winds carried their songs with ease, and in their hearts was a new certainty. They were no longer wanderers upon the land, but keepers of its harmony. Yet even as they rejoiced, some carried doubt in their hearts. Desire was not dead, only subdued. The elders warned that the journey of atonement was never complete, for every generation must choose balance anew. The people nodded, but the serpent, coiled deep within the waters, knew the truth better than any. The struggle between desire and harmony would echo for as long as the rivers flowed. Still, for now, peace reigned. The first people had remembered the song, and the serpent rested with a measure of hope. The valleys were scarred, but they lived. The rivers were altered, but they sang. And humanity, though flawed, was learning once more to walk upon the serpent's back with humility. Generations passed like the flowing of the great river. The scars left by the serpent's wrath softened under the touch of time. Valleys once raw and jagged grew lush with grasses and trees, their wounds healed by seasons of rain. Streams carved by the flood became lifelines for animals and people alike, feeding groves of fruit and fields of wildflowers. The land bore both memory and renewal, and in its beauty lay a silent reminder. Destruction could give birth to life if balance was respected. The first people, humbled by their pilgrimage of atonement, began to weave the lessons of the serpent into every part of their lives. These lessons did not remain only as spoken words or painted images. They became traditions, rituals, and laws that shaped entire generations. The teaching of the elders who had once walked the pilgrimage, became keepers of the story. They gathered children beneath the stars and retold the tale of the serpent. Its awakening in the dreaming, its carving of rivers and valleys, the discord of desire, the wrathful flood, and the journey of renewal. Their voices carried both warning and wonder, each word heavy with memory. When the children asked why the serpent had punished them, the elders answered, "Because we forgot that the river is not ours. We are its children, not its masters. To take without gratitude is to strike at the serpent's heart." When they asked why the serpent had spared them, the elders said, "Because it loves us. We are part of its dream. Though we wound it, it does not abandon us, for without us, who will carry its story?" Thus, reverence was taught not as fear alone, but as love entwined with responsibility. Songs and dances of memory, the people created new songs to honor the serpent. At dawn, they sang of flowing waters, their voices rising like mist. At dusk, they sang of the rainbow that bridged earth and sky, a sign that the serpent watched. Their dances mimicked the serpent's movements, slow coils, sudden strikes, and flowing arcs, performed around fires whose smoke carried prayers into the heavens. During the season of rains, when rivers swelled and thunder rolled, they performed the dance of the flood. Men painted their bodies with lightning patterns, women traced rainbow arcs across their arms, and children splashed through the shallows, laughing as though to remind the serpent that joy, too, was sacred. In these ceremonies, fear and gratitude mingled, binding the people together. The law of sharing the floods had taught the people the dangers of greed, and so they crafted the law of sharing. No bend of the river belonged to one alone. No grove could be guarded for a single family. When a hunter returned with game, the meat was divided among all. When fruit was gathered, seeds were always replanted. The elders enforced the law not with spears, but with story. A child who hoarded was reminded of the great flood. A man who took more than he needed was asked, "Do you wish to call the serpent's wrath again?" The memory of disaster was sharper than any weapon, and so the people kept to balance. Caves of story along the river's course. The people painted caves with ochre, charcoal, and clay. These caves became living books of memory. One showed the serpent coiled around mountains, its body carving valleys. Another showed waves swallowing camps, with tiny figures clinging to trees. Yet another showed a rainbow arched above dancing people, symbol of reconciliation. Each generation added new images. Children placed handprints beside the great coils, marking themselves as part of the story. Hunters drew fish and kangaroos, showing gratitude for the serpent's gifts. Elders traced spirals, symbols of water's eternal flow. The caves became sacred classrooms, where the land itself spoke through color and form. Trials of the young, to ensure no child grew without reverence. The people created the trials of the young. When a boy or girl reached the age of maturity, they were sent to live alone by the river for several days. They were given no food but what they could find, no shelter but what they could build. During this trial, they were told to listen. The river would speak, sometimes in the rustle of reeds, sometimes in the call of birds, sometimes in dreams filled with rainbow light. When they returned, they shared what they had seen or heard, and their visions became part of the community's wisdom. Some returned with songs of joy, describing rainbows dancing on the waves. Others returned with warnings, saying they had dreamed of storms or floods. All were embraced, for every vision was considered a gift from the serpent. The whisper of doubt, even as traditions deepened, shadows lingered. Desire, though subdued, never vanished. Sometimes hunters quarreled over who had speared a fish. Sometimes families wished to keep the best fruits for themselves. And sometimes, in seasons of drought, whispers of fear rose. What if the river does not give enough? What if sharing leaves us with nothing? The elders reminded them that doubt was part of being human. Balance was not a single choice, but a path walked every day. Even when we stumble, they said, we must rise again, for the serpent watches not for perfection, but for effort. Harmony with the land over time. The people grew skilled at living with the land rather than against it. They learned to follow the migrations of animals, never taking too many from one place. They learned which plants to harvest and which to leave, ensuring regrowth. They learned to move their camps with the seasons, so no single place was exhausted. They saw the river not only as water, but as ancestor, friend, and teacher. They spoke to it in prayer before fishing, thanked it after drinking, and taught children to place their hands upon the surface and whisper their names, so the river would know them. The serpent's quiet presence, though the serpent no longer rose in fury, its presence was always felt. Rainbows appeared after storms, and the people bowed in reverence. Strange ripples sometimes moved against the current, and children whispered that the serpent was passing. Dreams of coils and colors continued, carried on winds that rustled leaves at night. The people never forgot the flood, but they also never forgot the rainbow. They understood now that the serpent was both destroyer and creator, punisher and nurturer. To honor, it was to honor the balance of all things, that a legacy carried forward as the years turned into centuries. The story of the rainbow serpent became the heartbeat of the people. It was told at births, sung at marriages, and remembered at funerals. Every person carried it within them, like water carried in the veins of the land. And so, though generations changed, the covenant endured. The rivers and valleys remained sacred, living proof of the serpent's dream. The people walked carefully upon the earth, singing songs that echoed across time, ensuring that harmony would not be forgotten. But the serpent, watching from the depths, knew the truth. Stories could be remembered, but they could also be twisted. Songs could be sung, but they could also be silenced. Balance was not eternal. It had to be renewed with each generation. The test was never finished, for humanity's heart was a river of its own, always flowing, always shifting. The generations rose and fell like waves upon the river's shore. Children became elders. Elders returned to the soil, and new voices carried the songs of old. Through it all, the story of the rainbow serpent endured, woven in a fireside chants, painted upon cave walls, and danced beneath the endless stars. Yet even as the years stretched into centuries, the people knew one truth above all. The story was not simply about the past. It was alive as the river that wound through valleys, as alive as the colors that arched across the sky after rain. The serpent was not gone, nor was it merely sleeping. It dreamed still, coiled within every stream, every raindrop, every rainbow. And humanity lived inside that dream. The living story elders often told the young, the dreaming is not behind us. It flows around us, beneath our feet, above our heads. When you drink from the river, you drink the serpent's breath. When you walk through valleys, you walk along its back. When the rainbow touches the sky, the serpent is opening its eyes to remind us it is here. These words shaped how the people moved through the world. They did not see themselves as rulers of the land, but as characters within its story. Each hunt, each gathering, each step upon the soil became part of the ongoing dreaming. To live without respect was not simply a mistake. It was to break the story, to dishonor the dream that held them all. Echoes of the wrath, though harmony often reigned, whispers of discord never fully disappeared. There were times when greed resurfaced, when a hunter speared more fish than needed, or a family took too many fruits. And in such times, signs would appear. The river running strangely high after a clear night, storms rising without warning, lightning striking too close for comfort. The people knew these were reminders, not accidents. The serpent's wrath had scarred the land once, and it would not hesitate to scar it again. The memory of the Great Flood lived not only in story, but in the land itself. Deep valleys carved by coils, branching streams that spoke of a once roaring torrent. To forget was to risk reliving that terror when quarrels threatened to divide them. Elders would gather all beneath the stars and retell the story. They would point to the valleys and say, "See where the serpent struck the earth." They would trace rainbows in the sky and say, "See how it still watches." And slowly, quarrels would quiet, replaced by uneasy laughter and renewed promises of balance. The gift of storytelling, the greatest legacy of the serpent, was not the rivers themselves, nor the fertile valleys, but the gift of storytelling. The people realized that as long as the story was told, the serpent lived within their words. Each time a child repeated the tale, each time a dancer traced coils in the sand, each time an elder painted spirals on stone, the serpent's dream flowed on. Storytelling became the bridge between past and future, between human and spirit, between earth and sky. Through story, the people remembered that they were never alone. Through story, they honored the balance, the eternal dreaming in time. The people came to understand the deepest truth. The Rainbow Serpent was not only creator of rivers and valleys, not only guardian of harmony, not only punisher of greed. The serpent was the dreaming itself, the eternal spirit of creation that flowed through all things. Its coils were not just the rivers, but the veins of the earth. Its breath was not only wine, but the spark of life itself. Its colors were not only rainbows, but the spectrum of existence. To honor the serpent was to honor life in all its forms. Thus, when a person drank from the river, they whispered thanks not only to water, but to the dreaming. When they buried their dead, they sang not only of loss, but of return to the serpent's eternal coils. Life and death, growth and decay, joy and sorrow, all were part of the serpent's endless dream. The legacy beyond as the people flourished across the land, carrying the serpent's story with them. They passed through countless landscapes, deserts where rivers were rare, forests where streams sang through the roots, coasts where salt water embraced fresh. And in each place, they saw the serpent's mark. Some said the mountains were where it had rested, coiling its vast body until stone rose around it. Others said the stars were scales shed from its back, glittering forever above. Everywhere they went, they found signs of the serpent, reminders that the dreaming was endless and everywhere. The story was not bound to one river or one valley. It belonged to all creation. The final teaching one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in brilliant hues of red, orange, and violet, an elder gathered the children for what she called the final teaching. "Remember this," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "The serpent is not here to grant us gifts or to punish us for mistakes. It is here to remind us that all life flows together. Rivers, valleys, animals, people, we are not separate threads, but one weaving. If we pull too hard, the weaving tears. If we hold too lightly, it unravels. But if we walk in balance, the weaving endures strong and beautiful." The children listened, wide-eyed, their faces glowing with firelight. And though they were young, they felt the weight of her words settle into their hearts. The eternal return, the people knew that one day, the serpent might rise again, not in wrath alone, but in renewal. For creation was never finished. It was always flowing, always dreaming. Perhaps new valleys would be carved, new rivers born, new songs sung, and humanity would once again be tested, asked to remember the covenant of balance. But they did not fear this. For they knew that as long as the story was told, as long as songs rose and hands painted rainbows on stone, the serpent's dream would live on. And to live within that dream was not a burden, but the greatest gift of all. So they sang into the night, their voices mingling with the rustle of reeds, the cries of birds, and the whisper of flowing water. Their songs carried across valleys, rising into the sky where rainbows waited. And in the depths of the river, the serpent stirred, not in anger, nor in sorrow, but in quiet satisfaction, for the dream was alive. The story was alive. And as long as rivers flowed and valleys stretched wide beneath the sky, the Rainbow Serpent would remain, eternal, watchful, and dreaming.